eliminate slavery because of the moral arguments. It's because slavery makes it harder for white people to take over Native American land and become what Thomas Jefferson would call the yeoman, the self-made individual through rugged individualism who pulls himself up by his bootstraps. So Baltimore's at a crossroads. And here, as the Civil War begins to present itself, there's a moment in which these two competing visions of the good life, of heaven and hell, of utopia, begin to clash. So we're going to try something new for this episode. As a researcher, I am deeply influenced by a lot of different podcasts I listen to. One of them is called Hardcore History. And in it, the person who does the podcast, Dan Deacon, does a long-form analysis of different historical topics. And while I think it's a great concept, I realized that there was nothing similar for black folks to tell our stories. So this is a story I've been telling for a while, but I never have the time or space to get the depths that I really feel I need to on this story. It's the story of 3 riots that happened in Baltimore. And while I'm more interested in the history side and the politics side, I am interested in the hardcore side. So for folks who are fans of hardcore history, there will be some blood, there will be some violence. But there's going to be more analysis and historical context that I think probably shows more of how we at LBS do our unique form of historical analysis. So with that, let's go on to the conversation. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunken, a shattered visage lies, its frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that sculptors well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed them. And on the pedestal these words appeared, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my work, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. That's a poem by a name named Percy Shelley. And when I think of it, I think of Baltimore. I think a lot of folks think Baltimore is a city that has no history. And I think that history has been lost. Baltimore is in the unique position. It's not quite north, but it's not quite south. Nowadays, it likes to think of itself as part of something they call the Northeast Corridor. But that's not its real history. Maryland's, of course, a slave state, and it has a fraught and problematic history when it comes to issues of race. And I'm interested in telling this story because I think that few cities have been so constantly seen as both heaven and hell. The Wire has a line that says, it's a thin line between heaven and here. And I think that you see this cycle in Baltimore of Armageddon, destruction, but also belief the city can be renewed. And so few cities make a mockery of human ambition the way Baltimore does. And that's what this poem is about. Shelley is an Englishman writing in the 19th century. And in that time, a statue of the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramses, who he calls Ozymandias, is coming to the United Kingdom from Egypt. And Shelley looks at this and he says, look, you thought you were so great. You had these military battles. There's this great battle called the Battle of Kadesh in the Egyptian war against the Hittites, this war of Egyptian expansion. Not all of African history is as great as some of us like to think. And Shelley looks at this and says, this guy thought that he could rule the world, but look at him now. He's been humbled by his failure. And this is interesting because while Shelley is getting at universal human experience, we have to view it through the lens of a white man looking at Egypt. There's an entire study of Egypt called Egyptology. And if we are to believe the cynics of Egyptology, of which I am one, it's essentially written to explain Egypt out of Africa. Egypt has all these great historical advances. And if they were African, we'd have to challenge our beliefs on race. So Egyptology comes around to try to theorize and explain how Egypt was related to the Greeks and derivative of the Greeks. And this poem is part of what some people call an Orientalist view of the world, this sort of romanticizing of Egypt, but also making them inferior to the West. As we know now, that's not true. Many of the advances that people claim Egypt copied from Greece actually works the other way around. Greece copied them from Egypt, but the people studying it just couldn't see it. And I think we're in the exact same position as the Egyptologists as we are today with black folks in Baltimore. There's a deep history, but people don't see it. They see the riots, they see despair, they see the wire. And this podcast is designed to fix that history as well as I can. So this started around the 2015 riots, and I've made it a personal point to not talk about the 2015 riots. Well, first of all, we don't call them riots. We call it the 2015 uprising. But I make it a personal point to not say anything about the 2015 riots without mentioning the other riots in Baltimore's history. But even when I do that, I don't have the time to really go in depth to explain all the links, all the nuance, and all of the complexity that goes into how Baltimore became what it is. How it is this emblematic example of the human desire to fear Armageddon, but believe that somehow, some way, we can bring utopia here on Earth. And if we view that through a racialized lens, we can really begin to maybe understand what's happening in Baltimore. So I say all that to say that I'm going to do a historical analysis of Baltimore. And even with all the time I have on this podcast, I won't do all of it justice. I'm not John Henry Clark, famous historian in black history. But I want to do an analysis of Baltimore as an example of Armageddon and rebirth, what some people call the study of eschatology. This is a term that comes from Bible study, the study of Revelation, the second coming of Jesus, the ending of things, and the potential rebirth of things. So while I'm not John Henry Clark, I do believe what he says. When he says history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. And that's what I hope to do today. So with that, let's start at the beginning. All the way at the beginning. I'm talking 1600s. I'm talking John Smith. I'm talking about something called the Tidewater. This is a term that they used in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries to explain the Chesapeake Bay area, early colonization, tobacco plantations. And this is when Baltimore, for the first time perhaps, is seen as a potential utopia. John Smith writes in his diaries about the beauty of the land around the Chesapeake Bay. And he writes, "The North Cape is called Cape Charles. Within this country, they have the prerogative over the most pleasant lands known for large and pleasant navigable rivers. Heaven and earth never agreed better to frame a place for man's habitation." End quote. And I learned this quote in geography class. And while he was talking about the Chesapeake Bay in general, including Virginia, we learned it as part of our history of how we learned about Baltimore. Baltimore was once a place that could be this utopia. But of course, one man's utopia is another man or woman's Armageddon. You don't have to have a stretch of the imagination when one hears John Smith. Many people think of Pocahontas, and it is indeed that John Smith. And you can imagine the whitewashing of the destruction of Native Americans here in this part of the country. He goes on in his journals to say that this land around Baltimore was not habitated by natives. We now know that's not quite true. The Piscataway tribe used this as hunting grounds. And indeed, there was a Native American settlement just south of the city. But if we go forward a little bit in time, we can begin to see, again, one man's heaven is another man's hell, because this theory of what they call the land of pleasant living, this tidewater culture, meant you had to have a plantation. This is the theory of the good life we're talking about here. Other people making you rich, and you enjoying a life of culture and leisure at the expense of stolen human capital. You don't have to look far to Frederick Douglass, for whom Baltimore serves as the torture of Tantalus, in many ways, Tantalus being, of course, the figure from Greek mythology, who's starving but can't reach the grapes, and thirsty but can't reach the water. Douglass is starving for knowledge, and people around him are reading in Baltimore, where he's taken as a teenager, but he struggles to get it. He sees the ships leaving and going far away, but he can't quite get on it yet. Of course, he eventually steals himself away. But the idea is that Baltimore serves as this perfect storm, this middle ground between the North and the South, from two competing visions of the good life. One, where you have a plantation and you own slaves. The other, where you get access to Native American land for free, and you are industrialist, and you are building factories and bringing America on the industrial world stage. These two can't coexist. You can't have a big plantation run by slaves and open that land up for settlement by white settlers. So when people say the Civil War wasn't only about slavery and morality, they're exactly right. And many of these tensions can be seen in Baltimore. For example, think of the Free Soil Party, which is a notorious anti-slavery party that rises up in the 1850s. When they say free soil, they mean just that, but for white people. And this is not about ending slavery because of the moral arguments. It's because slavery makes it harder for white people to take over Native American land and become what Thomas Jefferson would call the yeoman, the self-made individual, through rugged individualism who pulls himself up by his bootstraps. Remember that term, rugged individualism. So Baltimore's at a crossroads. And here, as the Civil War begins to present itself, there's a moment in which these two competing visions of the good life, of heaven and hell, of utopia, begin to clash. In the build-up to the Civil War, there becomes a moment which President Lincoln, newly elected, has to travel to D.C. through Baltimore. And journalist Michael Williams, in a book that he was writing called City Under the Guns, which talks about the Baltimore occupation, talks about what happened when the Republican anti-slavery president and his army goes through Baltimore, which at that time had a huge pro-Confederate base. Fun fact, the book that Mr. Williams claims to be writing with this beautiful prose, I don't believe ever gets published. Again, it looks like Baltimore has no history. On the afternoon of April 18, 1861, Baltimore Mayor George W. Brown dispatches a strong letter of warning to Abraham Lincoln. On top of this, the president had to contend with Baltimore, a city the British once branded a nest of pirates. Its deeply pro-Southern populace made it unfriendly ground for the rail splitters, and now he received a letter in which Baltimore's mayor expressed his citizens' universally decided wish that he withdraw his order for 75,000 troops. The suggestion was completely out of the question. The Confederate Army was preparing for battle just across the Potomac. Without a substantial military force to protect it, the United States capital remained an inviting target, and Northern troops' shortest route was through the major railroad hub of Baltimore, the North's gateway to the South. But the journey's romance soured for the new troops as they neared Baltimore. The regiment's commander, Colonel F. Jones, held dispatches from railroad officers warning that his men would likely meet strong resistance there. Few of the men spoke if they neared the city. The metallic scrapping of ramrods and the trays of rhythmic clatter were the only sounds that filled the coach. That is, until Colonel Jones entered the car and broke the silence with an ominous set of instructions. The regiment will march through Baltimore in a column of sections, armed at will, he announced. You will undoubtedly be insulted, abused, and perhaps assaulted, to which you will pay no attention, even if they throw stones, bricks, or other missiles. But, Jones added, if you are fired upon, and any of you is hit, your officers will order you to fire. Like all Washington-bound passenger trains arriving from Philadelphia, Lincoln had to switch trains at the B&O Line's Camden Station. Remember that name, Camden Station. The tedious transfer took passengers around the city's harbor 4 blocks north of President Street. On April 19th, the 6th Massachusetts was about to make that trip in broad daylight, through streets teeming with Southern sympathizers. Baltimore had always been seen as an explosive city, hypersensitive to the shifting currents of politics. The present crisis was no exception. Inside the rail cars, the air was thick with tension. Every man tightened his grip on his Springfield, and most avoided looking through the windows for fear of locking eyes with a pro-Confederate rough. By the time they had gone a few blocks, the 6th had attracted an angry crowd, spewing a torrent of epithets punctuated by cheers for Jeff Davis. Jeff Davis, of course, being Jefferson Davis, the upcoming leader of the Confederacy. And just for you listeners who may not be from Baltimore, imagine Baltimore as a square with a small triangle attached to its left end. It's a square, but there's water going through the middle of the square, which only leaves a sliver of land on its left side that turns into a triangle that juts out essentially along the water. And this is right where the land meets the water in the center of the city, Baltimore's port. So if you can imagine, the center city is being the epicenter for an oncoming riot. The quote continues. The growing mob followed the line of cars, now 7 long, as it turned onto Pratt. Suddenly, the onlookers unleashed a shower of paving stones and gunfire on the 7th coach, which was carrying Major Watson and 50 troops. 2 men were hit in the head and upper body with bricks, and another soldier lost his thumb to a pistol shot. Holding his bloody hand, the latter requested permission to return fire, which Major Watson promptly granted. That volley repelled the rioters long enough for the Major and his men to escape. Their car was the last to make it to Camden Station, arriving windowless and riddled with bullet holes. Back at Pratt Street, an orgy of destruction unfolded. Rioters dumped heavy anchors and carton loads of sand onto the trucks. Once word came the trucks were now impassable, the 220 men who still needed to reach Camden Station wheeled into columns outside the President Street Depot, under the command of stout Captain Albert S. Fallsby. Without hesitation, he gave the order to march, but as the column moved forward, they were surrounded by a howling mob of secessionists, shouting that they would kill every, quote, white nigger of them before they reached Camden Station. One rioter drew a swell of cheers from the mob as he took position in front of the 6th line, marching oafishly with a dangling Southern palmetto flag from a piece of flimsy limbers. 3 blocks of the charade was all Lieutenant Lynn could stand. He coolly stepped out of line, ripped down the flag, and shoved it under his coat, then rejoined the march as though nothing had happened. The crowd responded with a fusillade of bricks and gunfire that injured at least 6 troops. 4 blocks west, at the corner of Gay and Pratt Street, the mob loosed a heavy barrage of stones and hot lead. "That's right, give it to them," a rioter shouted. "They won't shoot. They're too afraid of their cowardly necks," shrieked another. Finally, Fallsby barked out an order to fire. The 6 men raised their rifles and delivered a volley, then jogged 200 feet to South Street, where more stones and pistols rained down. Again, the 6 returned fire. 11 rioters dropped in that salvo, one of them hit in the throat. The regiment fired into the crowd one last time before Police Marshal George Proctor Kane and 50 officers arrived to form a barrier between the troops and the mob. To ensure no one attempted to pass, Kane, a burly, no-nonsense tough, raised his rifle and cried out, "Keep back, men, or I will shoot." Kane's reputation intimidated even the toughest roughs, helping to quell the riot. Moments later, the 6th was able to march the rest of the way to Camden Station, where they bounded a train to Washington, D.C. Reaction to the riot extended well beyond Baltimore. Many Americans, north and south, had still held out some hope the conflict might be resolved before much blood was shed. The events of April 19th extinguished that last hope, and it was now clear that a long and bloody conflict lay ahead. The Union went on to occupy the state of Maryland during the Civil War. Many of you know that Maryland was a so-called border state. So while it had slaves, it did not go to the Confederacy, essentially because it was occupied. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Maryland when it was issued. So this begins a political shift in Maryland away from slavery directly. But that doesn't mean it was a shift away from white supremacy. The Republicans, again, Lincoln's party, took over for a while. But then the Democrats took over. And with certain exceptions, they've remained in power ever since. And that meant a lot of things. But one thing it surely meant was that the land that John Smith envisioned, the land of pleasant living, was gone for good. Hi, Lawrence again to talk to you about LBS Sustainers. So, as I hope you know by now, LBS is based in Baltimore, Maryland, and it means something very specific to be from this town. It's a town run by Democrats who all say they love black people, they're in favor of racial justice, but has deep problems with racism and white supremacy. Maybe that's why we've been so hard on the assumptive logic of liberalism in this podcast series. But when you're from Baltimore, you understand the importance of building independent political power. And we're hoping you all in the audience can begin to understand that and go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain to help support the work that we do. We're not just doing podcasts. We are producing books, we're producing research, and we're doing real political work on the ground. And if you happen to not be from Baltimore, I really hope that you value the autonomous intellectual innovations we're producing, because we're looking to expand the amount of work that we do in terms of producing knowledge, which can help serve as a model for people around the country. So all of this is contingent upon your support. We're trying to innovate, not be a nonprofit, and be entrepreneurial and self-sustaining in our work. So if you think this is valuable, whether you're from Baltimore or not, please go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. Thank you. So as I put together this outline, I had to figure out how to organize information. And so what I'm going to talk about now is not going to be in strict chronological order, but there was time in the outline to put at the forefront something I felt was necessary. And that's a conversation of Black folks not as passive recipients of history, but as active agents within their own history. So it's pretty easy to see, again, this illusion that Black folks have no history, because history is written from a dominant perspective. But if you look at Baltimore, you see over and over again that the exact opposite is true. That Baltimore's history of Black agency is actually exemplary in the late 19th and early 20th century. So many people don't know that Baltimore had the highest population of free Blacks anywhere before the Civil War. And that does a few things. First, it makes Baltimore fertile ground for things like the Black church and Black businesses and Black guilds. But it also means that Baltimore has a long history of class differentiation between Blacks. And I believe that plays itself out in Baltimore's history. So let's look at some of these institutions that show Black agency. You have the American Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME Church. One of the examples of this in Baltimore is Bethel AME, a venerable Black church that didn't capitulate to what many people think of as the narrative around Christianity, it being inculcating docility. In fact, it was the exact opposite. The Black church was one of the few spaces where Black folks could come together, pool their money, and build things for themselves. My favorite story about this comes from a man named Sterling Stuckey in his book called Slave Culture. That was a preacher going around saying that Black folks were worshiping the wrong way, that they were too emotional in their praise. Some people would call this catching the Holy Ghost. And he would try to teach them how to worship in ways that conformed to the Eurocentric ideal of Christianity. And it was actually in Baltimore, when he spread this message, that he was actually beaten up by two Black churchwomen. And that was one of the proudest moments I'd ever experienced reading a history book. But that just shows you the strengths of the culture of Black folks in Baltimore. But it wasn't just limited to the church. We also have the Chesapeake Dry Dock Company, which is a Black cooperative of shipbuilders and caulkers based in Baltimore. A guy named Isaac Myers was a visionary about building Black economic power. And when the white folks at the docks excluded Black folks from building ships, they built their own company to build their own ships. And many people also don't know, again, not chronological order, but W.E.B. Du Bois lived in Baltimore for 20 years. And he actually did a study, a historical study, of Black cooperative economic ventures in Baltimore. And I want to read a quote. It's not too long, but it does go in depth. That actually gives you some actual historical analysis of just how strong these Black cooperative economic entities were. Quote, "There's probably no city in the land where there are as many societies among the colored people as in Baltimore. And several of the large societies which are spread far and wide, north and south, had their origins here. Nearly all the societies are beneficial, but they may be divided into generally two classes, beneficial merely and those with secret features. In order to help one another in sickness and provide a decent burial, through a system of small but regular payments, beneficial societies were formed among little groups of acquaintances or fellow laborers. In Baltimore, they date back to 1820 and were afterwards specifically exempted from the state's laws forbidding meetings of colored people. 25 at least have been formed before the war. From 1865 to 1870, 17 more were formed. And since 1870, 20 or more have been added. In 1884, was held a meeting of many connected with these societies to arouse more general interest. 40 of them gave an aggregate membership of over 2,100. Nearly 1,400 members have been buried, and over $45,000 having been given in funeral expenses. $125,000 have been given as sick dues. A few of these beneficial societies have been disbanded. A few have changed to secret societies. Very few of them have been badly managed, although unincorporated and without any public oversight. And everybody seems to speak well of them. End quote. So again, I am thinking about what we said about Egyptology. How everyone looked to Egypt to try to explain it. But they didn't even know what they weren't seeing. And when people look at Baltimore again, they seem to think that black folks have always been in this so-called down bad state. But our historical analysis shows that's not true. So let's go forward in history. Let's take a quick tour of some of these black institutions built in the 20th century, the early 1900s. You have a black educator named Fanny Jackson Coppin, who was so proficient at teaching young black children that in the early 1900s, she was flown to South Africa to teach them. We have an artistic history in Baltimore where folks like Billie Holiday and Cab Calloway grew up on the city's west side. You have one of the largest black businesses in the whole country called Park Sausages, based in Baltimore. And many people don't know Baltimore is the birthplace, original, and current home of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Again, Du Bois lived here for 20 years, and part of what he was doing is working and building the NAACP. But these institutions did not operate in a vacuum. Baltimore, again, shifted away from slavery, but did not shift away from white supremacy. Baltimore was a Democratic Party stronghold, the old Democratic Party of the Southern Democrats. And part of what they did is they actually allowed the state to take over control of the police force here. There was a time where the Republicans, Lincoln's party, had some sway in Baltimore City, but the Democrats basically ran the rest of the state. And there was concern, some of it potentially legitimate from what I read, that the Republican-affiliated police force was suppressing votes for the Democrats. So the state legislature, again the state house in Maryland, that's in the city called Annapolis, took control away of local control for the local Baltimore Police Department and put it in the hands of the state, at least technically. And that's just one small example of things that happened during the 20th century. Baltimore is one of the legal birthplaces of legalized housing segregation. But it's more insidious in terms of how it interacted with these independent black institutions. The Chesapeake Dry Dock Company folded up, in part because they couldn't get access to collateral. They couldn't get access to loans from white lending establishments, and other analysis of black institutions have led to similar conclusions that they were frozen out of capital markets here in Baltimore. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the black middle class in Baltimore being one of the strongest in the country. There are certain parts of the city where there are these big, beautiful houses that are occupied by black people ever since the early 1900s. But part of what happens to the wealth build up in those middle-class neighborhoods is that there's a process called blockbusting that makes it harder for those neighborhoods to appreciate and value. What happens is that real estate agents know that they can scare white folks to moving to the county, and thus they create panics to make them move out, then resell the houses of white people to black people at much higher rates, because there are only a few places black folks can live because of restricted housing covenants that are now informal. One of the most nefarious tactics that some real estate agents would use is they would pay a black woman to walk down a white street with a baby carriage, with a baby inside. And the message to the white families was clear. There goes the neighborhood, with black folks not only here, but reproducing in my neighborhood. The message to white folks was that your property value was going to decline, and it was time to move out. Because of a deal that got struck in the 1800s, Baltimore is what's called an independent city. And that's really important because it's entirely politically independent of its county, which means that when white folks leave, all their money leaves and it legally can't flow back. So we have the beginnings of compounding racial inequality happening in Baltimore, especially beginning in the 1940s and 50s. Baltimore swells to 900,000 people. It's one of the largest cities in the country. But this is a boom based upon it partially being a port town. It becomes both a northern migration town and a slave town at the same time. Again, these two contrasting worlds smashing into each other. But starting in the 50s, some of the jobs begin to leave. The wartime boom begins to decline. Remember, you have an established black bourgeoisie in Baltimore. But because it's a northern migration town, you have southern blacks moving up to Baltimore, creating schisms within the black community. And remember, this is the hometown of the NAACP. And there's this vision, this dream, that if we were just respectable enough, if we just washed our marble steps enough, black folks could rise up and overcome. I would say this is another dream of rebirth and utopia in Baltimore. And there are examples of that rebirth and dream being shattered. One of them is the story of Thomas Brodus. He's a Navy shoreman on shore leave in the 40s who tried to hail an illegal taxi cab. When confronted by a police officer, he said he can spend his money however he wished and was promptly beaten to death. And while this created some activism and fervor, again, home of the NAACP, I see it as a emblematic example of how that vision of a NAACP, if you will, vision of black respectability in Baltimore was doomed to fail. And all this is happening leading up to April 1968. What is it about Baltimore in April? Things just seem to happen. So all of this tension, the city's already declining in population. There's already schisms in the black community. There's already increasing unemployment. It's about double the national rate in Baltimore at 68. And Martin Luther King is assassinated. At first, nothing seems to much happen. There are a few disruptions. But there's actually a Time news story called Why Baltimore Didn't Burn, basically saying that Baltimore was exempted from some of the strife and struggles that happen in other cities. But it was on a Saturday, April 7th, in Baltimore that something changed. There were peaceful rallies planned for that day. But because of what had happened in other cities, and because of the way of thinking by the power establishment in Baltimore, National Guardsmen and other police forces were deployed heavily throughout the town. And there is a extensive collection of oral histories gathered 40 years after the fact by the University of Baltimore, many of which talk about it was the interactions between these preemptively deployed police forces and sad and angry citizens that happened on that day, which precipitated the 1968 Baltimore riot, the second riot in today's episode.
Peace, everybody. My name is Lady Breon. I'm the cultural curator at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And I came to this organization because I really wanted to have an impact on Baltimore, specifically Black Baltimore. And as an artist and curator, I recognize that the lofty ideas of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is often missed by, your average day folks who don't speak that really highly intellectual, scholarly language. So I use my art and my advocacy to reach those people. And currently, I'm working to create a Black Arts District in West Baltimore, and your money as a sustainer can help not only support this podcast, but to support that work in West Baltimore. So please give $2, give $10, give $15 a month to help support the efforts of the Black Arts District, this podcast, and the general work of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. So simply visit lbsbaltimore.com/sustain to sign up.
Now, along with extensive oral histories, there's a pretty comprehensive timeline that the University of Baltimore was able to compile. And while I'm not able to go down the entire timeline, I do want to give you a feel of some of the things that were happening at that time and maybe walk you through some of the places that were impacted to show you the similarities between the 1861 riot and this riot. Again, we seem to be stuck in this pattern of history repeating itself. And if we don't study it and see it, we can't avoid it. So on Saturday, April 7th, 4 p.m., there's a commemorative interdenominational service. It's been generally peaceful. The people begin to interact with the National Guard, who's on standby the whole day. And there seems to be a feeling amongst the populace that, okay, you're going to treat us like animals, fine. We'll act like animals. It is at 5 p.m. that the first reports of store windows being smashed begins. This is 400 North Gay Street. Remember, Baltimore's a square with a tiny triangle jutting out along the water. So 400 North Gay Street's basically downtown, a little bit on the east side. 5:30 p.m., violence breaks out in the Gay Street ghetto area. So this is a concentration of black folks just north of the city's downtown. 6 p.m., first reports of looting at a dry cleaner, Yang Monument, same neighborhood. And if we listen to the voices of prominent black folks at the time, we can see the historical context that what happened in 68 was the product of a long history of building tensions in Baltimore. So part of the UB library is a quote from a man named Miriam Bascom, who is a prominent figure in Baltimore's history, former pastor of Douglas Memorial Church, former marcher with Martin Luther King, and he gives some historical context for what began to happen at that time. I came to Baltimore and I became rather active in what was going on here. There were some groups, the NAACP, headed by Miss Lily Jackson, and the Urban League, headed by Vernon Templeton. Of course, there were splinter groups. Students were becoming a little point of unrest. It was in 1949 there were no facilities, eating facilities, for black folks outside of the black community. In 1954, when I became a member of the grand jury of Baltimore, there was nowhere downtown where blacks, Negroes, colored people could buy food. There was so much hope in the community, and it was shattered by the untimely death of King. It was almost as if blacks in every community had suddenly been inoculated with an hypodermic needle and caught the disease of disturbance. And so they began to set fires, and it was just horrible. You could smell smoke anywhere in Baltimore City. The story goes that an old lady was seen carrying a small television during the disturbance, and word goes out that she said, "The Lord blessed me with this television," end quote. So you can see the similarities between the two riots, but they represent two conflicting visions of the world. The first riot was about the fear of the loss of superiority, that dream of the land of pleasant living. And the second was frustration over the loss of basic humanity. It's important to remember that King was losing popularity amongst whites and credibility amongst black at this time. His nonviolent, direct action approach didn't seem to fit with the rising desire for self-determination and black power, what some people would call militancy. But he still had deep respect in the black community, and if his vision of nonviolent direct action could be snuffed out, then I think you're once again seeing this potential vision of how the world can be better being crushed in Baltimore. And that's when the riot begins to go into higher gear on the night of April 7th. 10 p.m., dozens of stores on Greenmount Avenue begin to catch fire, and it crosses over to North Avenue. These are streets, and Greenmount is a street on the east side of Baltimore, going straight up to Johns Hopkins University. It's a red line in the city between affluent folks affiliated with Hopkins and poor blacks who aren't. North Avenue is a critical east-west corridor, about halfway up in terms of the box that is Baltimore, so right in the middle of the city. 10:10, Governor Spiro Agnew commits the National Guard. 10:30, violence on Gay Street is declared out of control. Some merchants armed with rifles board up their stores. 11 p.m., by this time the riot has crossed over to the west side. Looting begins on a street called Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue is a diagonal street going through the city's west side. 11:15, National Guard troops move from the 5th Regiment Armory on trucks. Things begin to quiet down. So let's go on to Sunday, the 7th. And let's raise a question about what's happening here. There's a question of what you could call planning and intentionality. And Lee Balin, a reporter from the Evening Baltimore Sun, talked about how he didn't see it as hostile or targeting or gangs. It was more about youth saying, let's get into trouble. And this is what happens on Sunday the 7th. A lot of trouble is gotten into. By noon, that's the first major fire of the day. There's a jail in the middle of Baltimore City, and by this time, the inmates begin to refuse lunch in their cells. By 1:30 p.m., the state attorney general was quoted saying the looting in the eastern half of the city has reached terrible proportions. Large crowds gather at Baltimore Street, the block area. They break up only at 3:30 as K-9 units begin to move in. At 2 o'clock, there's a 4 p.m. curfew, which is announced. Gasoline sales are banned. 4 o'clock, the curfew hits, and the rioting accelerates on the west side of Baltimore. Police try to move in to protect a burning liquor store, and they're getting rocks thrown at them and bottles. 6:14 p.m., President Johnson orders 2,000 Army troops into Baltimore. And by 7:30, we have the peak of the riots, a broad conflagration on the east side and the west side. So we need to look at some of what happens here from a direct perspective. Jewel Chambers, a reporter for the local Afro-American, gives us one of the few peeks that we have into a first-person account of what was happening in the riots from a black perspective. She writes, quote, "One of the most interesting vignettes was between North Avenue and Baker Street, black, lower middle class. There was this guy, black guy, telling people what's here and what you can take. He's sitting there and he's saying, and don't be lighting no matches. Don't be lighting no matches because I live upstairs. So take whatever is here. Only thing is cheap, but don't be lighting." And he probably saved it. They didn't light any matches. Then I went across the street and there was a corner store. It's a mom and pop store. They had done a job. There were cornflakes and flour all over the floor. But what got me, this is what sticks with me. There was this older woman and she was doing her shopping. She was very careful in what she wanted and what she got. You don't have to buy a pound of butter, you know. You can buy a stick. And she finished, and somewhere she found 2 sticks of margarine. 2 sticks, not the whole pound. She was just doing her shopping and taking exactly what she would have shopped for. At one point I said, "Don't you want a big box of cereal?" And the woman replied, "Oh no, dear." She didn't want a big box of cereal. And then I went along, because I was told, "Observe, but don't get too close. You're going to get yourself hurt." The key thing is nobody got killed. End quote. This isn't the vision of looters that we normally get. She goes on to talk about mob mentality and how she felt that folks got out of hand. But the precision she seems to note amongst the so-called looters, first of all, it's an old woman, and she's meticulously doing her shopping, but also amongst a conversation and dialogue between the looters and the so-called lootees. This isn't people burning down their own neighborhoods. This is something a little bit different, is what she's describing. One thing she talks about is some of the stores got burnt because they were using what's called books, which is informal credit. And if you burn the book, then you can eliminate what you owe to the store. And you can imagine many of the folks in the community may have felt that these folks were figuratively cooking the books, charging them for things more than they had racked up in credit. So burning the store isn't an irrational act of people who don't know what's good for them. It's in its own way a protest against inequitable economic conditions. Some of you out there may get the analogy of Fight Club, where they knock down the towers to erase their credit records for everybody. And in their own way, some folks in Baltimore may have felt that's what they were doing in 1968. So let's go on to Monday. 6 sniper incidences are reported just by midday. By 9 p.m., more reports on the west side than the east side. So you can imagine 2 locusts of red on 2 different sides of the city. By the morning, there was a whirlwind tour of officials trying to assess the damage. And by early afternoon, tear gas is used on 300 youth smashing into a grocery store on North Avenue. And this is where some of the conversation around propaganda and misinformation comes in. The gangs are rumored to be using walkie-talkies to coordinate how to avoid the police officers, which seems to contradict the report we got from Ms. Chambers. The looters didn't seem to be that coordinated or that focused on pure destruction. But we also have some of the sensationalism coming through. Negro slums east and west of downtown. Unruly gangs of white and blacks confront each other on the streets. These are the conversations that are happening on Monday. But by Tuesday, things begin to calm down. There's an incident on a street called Gilmore Street. Remember that name? Which 6 drunken men disturb a peaceful food distribution center. But by this time, there is a mixture of things happening with a crackdown to control the riots, but also the assertion of what we could call black civil society to get things back under control. Nonviolent civil rights groups are sent in with sound trucks to urge residents to remain in their homes. A list of merchants is compiled and the damage is beginning to be assessed as black community members patrol trouble spots in their plain clothes. There's actually a story of groups of people chanting, "That's enough, baby. That's enough." Chanting to their community that perhaps the message had been sent and it was time to end the conflagration. And so most tales of the riots end on that Tuesday, and you can see the damage. $8 to $10 million. That would be $71 million in today's currency. 288 liquor-related establishments burned or looted. 190 food stores vandalized. 6 people dead. This is not necessarily the most prominent riot of the 60s, but it seems to do a number on Baltimore's image around the country. That's what's more interesting to me than the violence and the blood. What is it about Baltimore that seems so inexorably attracted to when it comes to this vision of Armageddon and destruction? There's a song about Baltimore that comes out in the 70s. And I'm not much of a singer, so I'll say it as a poem, the lyrics, because I think it's perfectly demonstrative of what I'm trying to get across. The song is called "Old Baltimore," and it goes like this. Beat up little seagull on a marble stair, trying to find the ocean, looking everywhere. Hard times in the city, in a hard town by the sea. Ain't nowhere to run, there ain't nothing here for free. Hooker on the corner waiting for a train, drunk lying on the sidewalk sleeping in the rain. And they hide their faces and they hide their eyes because the city's dying and they don't know why. Oh, Baltimore, man, it's hard just to live. Oh, Baltimore, man, it's hard just to live. Get my sister Sandy and my little brother Ray. Buy a big old wagon, gonna haul us all away. Living in the country where the mountains high. Never coming back here till the day I die. And I don't think there's a better vision of Baltimore within the frame that I'm using, this thing called eschatology. The ending, the apocalypse, the destruction. Never coming back here. Moving away. And many of you hear these lyrics, and the voice you might be hearing is none other than Nina Simone, who is most associated with this song. But it is not written by Nina Simone. It's written by, and I had to double check it to make sure this was true, it's written by Randy Newman, and Nina Simone covers it. In fact, the way she tells it, she was just fulfilling obligations to her record label, and they basically gave her songs and forced her to sing. And I think this is perfect. We have this vision that, look, Baltimore's crap. Nina Simone told me so. And it's interesting because even other black cities don't seem to get it the way Baltimore gets it. You got Detroit, New Orleans, Oakland, pre-gentrification. Detroit has a terrible riot, 67, not 68. Far more damage. But it's still Motor City. It's still Rock City. New Orleans obviously has jazz, and Oakland has the left coast culture, even a protest culture that's celebrated, but not Baltimore. We know Baltimore is crazy. Nina Simone told us so. It's this vortex between the North and the South, and Baltimore just seems to fall off the map. In my research, I saw that it's never been a comprehensive historical study of the Baltimore Police Department. And there is actually a division between Northern police scholars and Southern police scholars. Two different theories of policing for slave states and non-slave states. And Baltimore falls right in the middle. And neither side seems to get it, so it just hasn't been done. So I think this idea of Nina Simone verifying what we all think we know about Baltimore, that Baltimore is somehow broken, but she's just singing the words of Randy Newman. And what did Randy Newman say? When someone asked him about this song, he said, "I don't know where it came from. It just came to me." Again, I think this is just perfect to illustrate what I'm talking about here. That Baltimore didn't die. And if anything, it was murdered. But we get the illusion that somehow black Baltimore just let itself down. That it was just broken and couldn't be saved. Nina Simone told us so. And if you believe what you're getting from these visions of Baltimore, again, the eschatology, the Armageddon, all Baltimore needs now is a savior. And surely enough, that's exactly what they thought they got. Thank you for listening to In Search of Black Power. Make sure to follow us, like, and subscribe on Twitter and Instagram at LBS Baltimore and on Facebook at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You can find this podcast at www.newtimbuktu.com and on iTunes, Google Play, and wherever you find podcasts. You can also support us and become a sustaining member at www.lbsbaltimore.com. In Search of Black Power was created by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, hosted by myself, Lawrence Grandpre, and Lady Breon. Our associate producer is Iore Odigizuwa, and our engineer is Justin Gladden. Our research assistant is Aaron Brown, logistical support from Nadira Smith. Thanks to the whole #LBS gang, and we'll see you next time in Search of Black Power.